The Montana night held no mercy for those who ran from their past. Rebecca Quinn learned this truth as pine branches tore at her dress, and roots threatened to send her sprawling across the forest floor. 7 months pregnant and 3 days without proper sleep, she pushed forward because the alternative was death. Behind her, 3 men crashed through the underbrush with the relentless rhythm of trained hunters. Their boots struck the ground in synchronized thunder. Their voices carried on the wind, cold and businesslike. "She can't run much farther. The baby will slow her down." Becca pressed one hand to her swollen belly and clutched a tree trunk with the other. Her lungs burned. Her vision blurred at the edges. The child inside her kicked hard as if protesting this desperate flight through darkness. She had come to Montana territory seeking invisibility, the kind of obscurity that vast wilderness could provide a woman fleeing monsters disguised as gentlemen. She had purchased 40 acres of scrubland with the last of her stolen money. She had begun building a cabin with her own hands, driving nails into rough-hewn timber until her palms bled and calloused over. For 3 months, life at the edge of civilization had turned her into a ghost. Dawn brought work that lasted until her body collapsed into sleep. Henrik Larsson, the Swedish farmer, whose land bordered hers to the east, received occasional nods but no conversation. Sometimes she caught him watching her cabin from the ridge, as if counting the boards or memorizing her daily routines. She told herself it was neighborly concern, nothing more. The isolation almost convinced her that Daniel Thornhill would never find her in this remote corner of the world. She was wrong. A gunshot split the night air. The bullet struck a pine tree 6 feet to her left, sending bark fragments spinning through the darkness. Becca stumbled and fell hard, her knee cracking against a buried stone. Pain shot up her leg like lightning. The 3 men emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden beneath bandanas. The tallest one stepped forward, a revolver gleaming in his right hand. "End of the road, Miss Quinn, or should I say, Mrs. Quinn, your employer sends his regards." Becca's fingers found the small knife she kept tucked in her boot. The blade was barely 4 inches long, meant for cutting rope and preparing kindling. Against 3 armed men, it was laughably inadequate. But she had not survived Daniel Thornhill's poison and manipulation only to surrender in a Montana forest. "Tell Daniel he can go to hell." The tall man laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "He probably will, ma'am, but you'll be there first." He raised his revolver. Becca closed her eyes and thought of Thomas Yates, the man whose child she carried. Thomas, who had died in flames because he loved her. Thomas, whose last words had been her name. The gunshot never came. Instead, the night exploded with the thunder of hoofbeats. A horse and rider materialized from the darkness like something conjured from desperate prayer. The rider sat tall in his saddle, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but the Colt .45 in his hand caught the moonlight and held it. His voice cut through the forest with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. 5 seconds. You leave or you die." The tall man spun to face this new threat. "This ain't your business, friend." The stranger fired once. The bullet passed so close to the tall man's ear that he flinched and stumbled backward. When the echo faded, the stranger's voice emerged even colder than before. 4 seconds. The 3 hired guns exchanged glances. Whatever they were being paid, it was not enough to face a man who shot with that kind of precision. They melted back into the forest, their footsteps gradually fading into silence. Becca remained on the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and fading adrenaline. She looked up at her unlikely savior. Even in the darkness, certain details stood out. The quality of his leather saddle. The gold ring on his left hand engraved with an ornate letter D. The way he held himself straight-backed and certain, like someone who had never questioned his right to command attention. He dismounted with fluid grace and approached slowly as if she were a wild animal that might bolt. When he knelt beside her, Becca saw his face properly for the first time. Strong jaw, eyes the color of winter sky, a face that belonged on ancient Roman coins, all sharp angles and classical proportion. "You hurt." His voice, stripped of its earlier menace, carried surprising gentleness. Becca shook her head, not trusting her voice yet. "Can you ride?" "I think so." He stood and offered his hand. Becca hesitated. In her experience, men who appeared in moments of desperate need always extracted a price for their intervention. But the alternative was waiting for Daniel's hired killers to return with reinforcements. She took his hand. His grip was strong and calloused, the hand of a man who worked with horses and rope and leather. He helped her to her feet with careful attention to her pregnant belly. "Dalton Ranch is 3 miles north. You'll be safe there. Why would you help me?" He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Because I need you. But explanations can wait. Right now, it's live or die. Your choice." Becca had spent 8 months running from questions that had no good answers. One more mystery seemed a small price for survival. She let him lift her onto his horse and settled into the saddle in front of him. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, and she felt the solid strength of his chest against her back. They rode through the darkness in silence. Becca's mind raced, trying to make sense of this stranger who killed with precision and spoke with educated diction. The gold ring on his hand, the expensive saddle, the absolute confidence in his posture. This was no ordinary cowboy. "What's your name?" she asked finally. "Cash Dalton." The name meant nothing to her, but she heard money and power in those 2 syllables. Becca had learned to read such things during her years working in Daniel Thornhill's law office. She had watched wealthy men move through the world with their casual assumption of importance, their belief that doors would always open and lesser people would always step aside. "And you are?" Cash asked. Rebecca Quinn." "Well, Rebecca Quinn, those men will be back. Probably with friends. You picked a hell of a place to run." "I wasn't running. I was building." She felt his surprise in the slight tension of his arms. "Building what?" "A cabin. A life. Something that belonged to me." Cash said nothing for a moment. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, "I understand that better than you might think." 8 months earlier, Rebecca Quinn had been a different woman entirely. Silk dresses and symphony attendance defined her evenings. Tea in mahogany-paneled drawing rooms filled her afternoons' conversations about literature, flowing as easily as the expensive china clinked. The world seemed fundamentally good back then, justice an inevitable force that would triumph over corruption. Daniel Thornhill murdered that woman as surely as if he had put a bullet in her skull. The memory began one October night in Boston, air sharp with approaching winter. Late work at the law firm meant copying depositions by lamplight while the office emptied around her. Only Daniel remained working in his private study behind a closed door. Rising to fetch more paper from the storage room, she noticed light spilling from beneath Daniel's door. Something made her pause. Perhaps intuition. Perhaps the whisper of footsteps that suddenly ceased. She pressed her ear to the wood and heard Daniel's voice, low and urgent. "The deed transfers tomorrow. No, he doesn't suspect anything. By the time he realizes the signatures are forged, I'll own everything from the river to the ridgeline." Silence as he listened to whoever spoke on the other end of the telephone line. "The Dalton property, that's more complicated. Cash Dalton isn't a fool. We'll need to be patient with that acquisition." More silence. Then Daniel's laugh, sharp and cold. "Of course I'm sure. I've been forging documents for 15 years. It's how I built this practice." Becca's blood had frozen in her veins. She backed away from the door, her mind reeling. Daniel Thornhill was one of Boston's most respected attorneys. He represented banks and railroad companies. Judges deferred to his legal expertise, and he was a criminal. She should have gone straight to the police. She should have found an honest lawyer and reported everything she had heard, but fear paralyzed her. Daniel had powerful friends. Who would believe a secretary over a man of his stature? So she did something both clever and catastrophically stupid. She started keeping a journal, every late-night phone call, every mysterious client meeting, every piece of correspondence that passed through the office. She recorded it all in a small leather notebook that she kept hidden in her room at the boarding house. And she fell in love with Thomas Yates. Thomas was everything Daniel was not. An engineer with rough hands and an honest smile. A man who built bridges instead of destroying lives. They met at a church social, and within a month Becca knew she wanted to spend her life with him. She told Thomas about Daniel's crimes, showed him the journal. Together they planned to take the evidence to the district attorney. Together they would see justice done. Daniel discovered her betrayal on a Thursday in February. Becca returned to her boarding house to find Thomas waiting in the parlor, his face grave. "He knows," Thomas said simply. "I don't know how, but Daniel knows." That night Daniel's men came. They poured kerosene around the boarding house and lit it while Becca and Thomas slept. The flames spread with terrifying speed. Thomas pushed Becca toward the window, made her climb out onto the narrow ledge. She screamed his name as smoke poured from the building. She watched him stumble and fall at the window, overcome by the fumes. She watched the building collapse with Thomas inside. The official report ruled it an accidental fire caused by a knocked-over lamp. The landlady's testimony supported this narrative. No one questioned that the landlady had recently made a substantial deposit in her bank account. Becca fled Boston the next day. She had her journal and enough money stolen from Daniel's safe to buy passage west. She had the growing certainty that she was pregnant with Thomas's child. And she had a hatred so pure and cold, it felt like a separate organ in her chest. She had come to Montana to disappear, to build something with her own hands that Daniel could never touch or corrupt or destroy. She had almost succeeded. Almost. Dalton Ranch materialized from the darkness like a vision from a fever dream. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built from timber so fine it must have been shipped from California. Windows glowed with lamplight. A wide veranda wrapped around the entire structure, supported by carved posts that spoke of craftsmanship and considerable expense. Around the main house, smaller buildings formed a constellation of wealth and industry. Barns that could shelter 100 horses, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, storage buildings and workshops, and a structure Becca realized must be a private stable, separate from the working livestock. Cash guided his horse toward the main house and dismounted in one fluid motion. Before Becca could attempt to climb down herself, he reached up and lifted her from the saddle with the same careful attention he had shown in the forest. "Welcome to Dalton Ranch." Becca stared at the house, at the obvious wealth it represented, and felt her stomach twist with apprehension. In her experience, men with this kind of money did not rescue pregnant women out of simple charity. There would be a price. There was always a price. The front door opened and a woman emerged onto the veranda. She wore a silk dress the color of cream, her blonde hair pinned in an elaborate arrangement that must have taken an hour to perfect. She moved with the easy grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Cash, it's past midnight. Where have you been?" Her eyes found Becca and widened with surprise and something less charitable. Disapproval, perhaps, or suspicion. Cash guided Becca up the steps with one hand on her elbow. "Ruby, this is Rebecca Quinn. She'll be staying with us for a while." Ruby Dalton studied Becca with the assessing gaze of someone conducting an inventory. Becca felt acutely conscious of her torn dress, her mud-stained hem, her hair falling loose from its braid. Next to Ruby's polished perfection, she must look like something dragged from a ditch. Another stray Cash. Last month it was that orphaned boy. The month before the widow from Willowbrook. "When exactly did you decide to turn our home into a charity house?" "Ruby," Cash's voice carried a warning. "Miss Quinn needs our protection. That's all you need to know for now." Ruby's expression suggested she had many more questions, but she stepped aside with visible reluctance. "Fine. I'll prepare the guest room, though I expect a full explanation tomorrow." She disappeared into the house, her silk dress whispering against the polished floor. Cash waited until she was gone before turning to Becca. "My sister means well. She's protective of the ranch. Of me. I don't need your charity, Mr. Dalton." "Good. Because I'm not offering charity." He led her through a door and into a world that might as well have existed on a different continent from the rough cabin Becca had been building. Persian rugs covered gleaming hardwood floors. Oil paintings hung in gilt frames. A crystal chandelier threw prisms of light across walls, papered in burgundy silk. Becca had grown up in modest comfort. Her father had been a carpenter, skilled and respected, but they had never lived in a house like this. She felt suddenly dizzy, whether from exhaustion or the shock of being transported from the forest floor to this palace of wealth. Cash noticed her sway and caught her elbow again. "You need rest, but first we need to talk. My study, please." He guided her down a hallway to a room dominated by a massive desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The smell of tobacco and leather hung in the air. Cash poured amber liquid from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses, handed one to Becca, and downed the other in a single swallow. "Your real name isn't Quinn, is it?" Becca's fingers tightened on the glass. "It is now. But it wasn't 8 months ago. 8 months ago you worked for Daniel Thornhill in Boston." The glass slipped from Becca's nerveless fingers. It hit the carpet without breaking, whiskey spreading in a dark stain. She stared at Cash with rising terror. "How do you know that—" Cash refilled his glass, his movements precise and controlled. "Because Daniel Thornhill stole 2,000 acres from me using forged documents. Because I've spent a year investigating every aspect of his business, trying to find evidence that would stand up in court. And because 3 months ago, my investigators discovered that his former secretary disappeared the same week as a suspicious fire that killed a man named Thomas Yates." He fixed Becca with those gray-blue eyes. "You're not running from a bad marriage or family scandal. You're running from Daniel Thornhill because you know what he is, and I'm guessing you have proof." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Becca gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. This was wrong. This was all wrong. She had come to Montana to hide, not to be found by someone who knew her secrets. Those men in the forest, you knew they would be there. I knew Daniel had people searching the territory. I've been watching the roads from the east for weeks. When my scouts reported 3 strangers asking about a pregnant woman traveling alone, I put the pieces together. Becca's mind worked furiously, trying to understand. "You saved me because you want to use me, as a witness." Cash set down his glass with deliberate care. "I saved you because Daniel Thornhill is a criminal who has evaded justice for too long. Because he steals land and poisons rivals and burns down buildings with people inside them. Because men like him only stop when someone makes them stop." He moved around the desk to stand directly in front of her. "Yes, I need your testimony. Yes, I want whatever evidence you have hidden away. But I also saved you because leaving you to die in that forest would make me no better than him. I don't believe you. I don't particularly care what you believe. I care about facts. And the facts are simple. You have information that can destroy Daniel Thornhill. I have the resources to keep you alive long enough to deliver that information in a court of law. We need each other." Becca wanted to run, wanted to flee this house and this man who spoke of justice and revenge with the same cold calculation she had heard in Daniel's voice, but her body was exhausted. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, reminding her that she was not making decisions for one life anymore. "I won't be used again. Then we'll call it cooperation, mutual benefit. You give me testimony. I give you protection until that child is born and Daniel is behind bars." Becca studied his face, searching for the lie she was certain must be there, but Cash Dalton's expression remained steady and unreadable. Whatever he was, he seemed to believe his own words. "What happens if I say no? Then you leave tomorrow morning with my best wishes and a fast horse, and Daniel's men find you within a week." It was not really a choice. It was the illusion of choice carefully constructed to let her pretend She had agency in this situation. Becca recognized the manipulation because she had seen Daniel use it 100 times, but Cash Dalton was not Daniel Thornhill. He had saved her life. He had not touched her beyond what was necessary. He spoke to her as if her opinion mattered, even as he maneuvered her into compliance. "I want something in writing, a contract, guaranteeing my safety and my child's safety until Daniel is convicted or killed." Surprise flickered across Cash's face, quickly masked. "You don't trust easily." "I learned not to." "Fair enough." Cash moved to his desk and pulled out paper and pen. He wrote in quick, efficient strokes, then slid the document across to Becca. "Read it carefully. Make any changes you want." Becca read slowly, examining every word for hidden traps. The contract was surprisingly straightforward. Cash promised protection for herself and her child until Daniel Thornhill was removed as a threat through legal or extra-legal means. In exchange, Becca would provide testimony and evidence. She added one line in her own hand. "Mr. Dalton agrees that Rebecca Quinn will not be housed as a dependent or charity case, but will contribute labor of equivalent value to the protection provided." Cash read the addition and smiled for the first time since Becca had met him. The expression transformed his face, making him look younger and far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. "You want to work in your condition. I can read, write, and manage accounts. I assume your ranch generates paperwork. Ruby handles the books. Then give Ruby a month off. I'll cover her duties." Cash's smile widened. "You really don't trust charity, do you?" "I trust work. I trust bargains that benefit both sides. I don't trust kindness from wealthy men." Something shifted in Cash's expression. The smile faded, replaced by a look of understanding that made Becca uncomfortable, as if he could see through her armor to the frightened woman beneath. "All right. You work for your keep. Fair exchange." He signed the contract with a flourish and handed her the pen. Becca signed with her new name, Rebecca Quinn, and tried to ignore the small voice in her head whispering that she was making a terrible mistake. Morning arrived too soon and too bright. Becca woke in a bed softer than clouds beneath quilts that probably cost more than her father had earned in a year. For a moment she could not remember where she was or how she had arrived in this palace of privilege. Then memory crashed back. The forest, the guns, Cash Dalton, and his calculated rescue. A knock at the door preceded Ruby's entrance. She carried a tray with tea and fresh bread, and her expression suggested this hospitality was delivered under protest. "Cash asked me to bring you breakfast. He's in the barn dealing with a difficult mare. He said you should rest today." Ruby set the tray on a side table and turned to leave, but Becca's voice stopped her. "Wait, please." Ruby paused, one hand on the doorknob. "Yes?" "I want to apologize for last night, for intruding on your home without warning." Ruby's rigid posture softened slightly. She turned back to face Becca, her expression still wary, but no longer openly hostile. "Cash has a habit of collecting strays, broken things that need fixing. I've learned to accept it even if I don't always understand it." "I'm not broken." The words came out sharper than Becca intended. Ruby's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I didn't mean to offend. I'm pregnant, not helpless, hiding, not defeated, and I intend to work for whatever shelter your brother provides." Interest flickered in Ruby's blue eyes. "Work doing what?" "Cash said you handle the ranch accounts. I can read, write, and calculate. Give me 1 week to prove I'm capable, and if I fail, I'll leave without argument." Ruby studied Becca with new attention, as if seeing past the torn dress and tangled hair to something more substantial beneath. "You have education? You speak like someone who's read books." "My father believed daughters deserved the same schooling as sons. He was unusual that way." "Mine believed the same thing." Ruby's voice softened with memory. "He taught me accounting because he said ranching was mathematics as much as cattle. Cash can manage the land and the horses, but numbers make him impatient." She crossed to the window and looked out over the ranch buildings spreading below. I've been wanting to visit friends in Helena. Haven't had time because the quarterly accounts need reconciling. If you're serious about working, I could use the help." "I'm serious." Ruby nodded slowly, coming to some internal decision. "Then we have a deal. But Miss Quinn, understand this. My brother has a good heart, sometimes too good. If you're planning to take advantage of his protective nature, you'll answer to me." Becca met Ruby's gaze steadily. "I would expect nothing less. If our positions were reversed, I'd say the same thing." "Good. Then we understand each other." Ruby moved toward the door, then paused. "Cash said you needed to visit Doc Brennan today to make sure the baby is healthy after last night's excitement. I'll have the carriage ready after breakfast." She left before Becca could respond. Alone again, Becca rose and examined herself in the full-length mirror. Her face was pale and bruised from the fall. Her dress was beyond repair, but her eyes held something new, not hope exactly, more like determination. She would take Cash Dalton's protection because she had no choice. She would use his resources to bring down Daniel Thornhill, but she would not become dependent on this wealthy rancher and his generosity. She would pay her debts through work. She would maintain her dignity. And when Daniel was finally defeated, she would leave this place and build the life she had come to Montana seeking. That was the plan, at least. She tried not to think about how few of her plans had survived contact with reality. Willowbrook was 20 miles from Dalton Ranch, a journey that took 3 hours in Ruby's well-sprung carriage. Becca used the time to study the landscape, memorizing landmarks in case she ever needed to make this journey alone and on foot. The town itself was larger than she expected. A main street lined with shops and businesses, a church with a white steeple, a schoolhouse at the edge of town, and positioned prominently on the corner, a building with a sign that read, "Samuel Brennan, M.D." Ruby helped Becca down from the carriage and led her inside. The waiting room was empty except for a young woman reading a book. She looked up as they entered and smiled with genuine warmth. "Ruby Dalton, what brings you to town, and who's your friend? This is Rebecca Quinn. She needs to see Samuel." The young woman's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, I'll let him know you're here." She disappeared through a door, and Becca heard low voices in conversation. After a moment, a man emerged. He was perhaps 32, with dark hair and intelligent eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles. His hands were clean and steady, the hands of a surgeon or artist. "Miss Quinn, I'm Dr. Brennan. Please come back." His examination room was spotless and well-organized. Medical texts lined shelves along one wall. Instruments gleamed in glass cases. Samuel gestured to the examination table and began preparing his equipment with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Dalton said you had a difficult evening. Let's make sure both you and the baby are healthy." The examination was thorough and professional. Samuel asked questions about her pregnancy history and symptoms with the detachment of a scientist recording data. But when he helped her sit up afterward, Becca saw something else in his expression: recognition. "You're from Boston." It was not a question. Becca felt her heart rate spike with sudden fear. Why would you think that Samuel removed his spectacles and cleaned them with deliberate care? "Your accent, the way you speak. I grew up in Boston. Lived there until 3 years ago. Lots of people leave Boston." "True, but not many pregnant women flee to Montana under assumed names." Samuel replaced his spectacles and fixed her with a penetrating stare. "Your real name is Rebecca Brennan, isn't it? You worked as secretary to Daniel Thornhill." The room tilted. Becca gripped the edge of the examination table to keep from falling. "I don't know what you're talking about." "My father was Professor Marcus Brennan. He taught contract law at Harvard until Daniel Thornhill destroyed his reputation with fabricated evidence. The scandal killed him, not quickly. It took 2 years of watching everything he'd built crumble into ruin. He hanged himself in his study on a Tuesday in March." Samuel's voice remained steady, but Becca heard the rage buried beneath clinical detachment. "I've spent 3 years researching Daniel Thornhill. I know every business he owns, every crime he's committed. And I know that shortly before you disappeared, you started asking questions about certain real estate transactions, questions that would have exposed Daniel's forgery operation. Becca's mind raced. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. She could not afford to trust anyone in this town, could not afford to let people know who she really was. But Samuel Brennan already knew. And if he wanted revenge against Daniel, as much as his expression suggested, he might be an ally rather than a threat. Your father. I remember him. He came to the office once trying to clear his name. Daniel had him thrown out. Samuel's jaw tightened. I know, I was waiting outside. I'm sorry. If I had known what Daniel was planning, I would have tried to help. You couldn't have stopped him. No one could. That's what makes men like Daniel so dangerous. They operate in the spaces where law and morality overlap poorly. He pulled a chair close to the examination table and sat down, his posture shifting from doctor to conspirator. But you can stop him now. Cash Dalton told me you have evidence, documentation of Daniel's crimes. Cash told you about me. Cash and I have been coordinating our investigation for 6 months. He wants his land back. I want justice for my father. We both need Daniel Thornhill in a prison cell or a grave. Samuel leaned forward, intensity radiating from every line of his body. What evidence do you have? Documents, testimony. Becca hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to reveal nothing, trust no one. But she was tired of carrying her secrets alone, tired of being the only person who knew the full scope of Daniel's crimes. She reached into her boot and pulled out a folded envelope protected by oiled leather against moisture and damage. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Daniel's precise handwriting. This is a letter Daniel sent to a doctor in Boston, asking for laudanum to be prescribed in my name. He planned to drug me, make me appear mentally unstable so he could control my testimony about certain financial irregularities I discovered. Samuel read the letter 3 times, his expression growing darker with each pass. This is evidence of attempted poisoning, of conspiracy. Do you have more? I have a journal, 2 years of observations, meetings, phone calls, suspicious transactions. It's not all evidence that would hold up in court, but it establishes a pattern. Where is this journal? Hidden. Somewhere Daniel will never find it. Samuel handed back the letter with visible reluctance. You need to give this to Marshal Hayes. He's a federal officer investigating Daniel for mail fraud and wire fraud. This could be the evidence he needs for an arrest warrant. Cash said the same thing, but one letter isn't enough. Daniel has lawyers. He'll claim it's a forgery that I'm a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Then we need more evidence. Witnesses. Documentation that can't be dismissed. A knock at the door interrupted them. Ruby poked her head in, her expression worried. Sorry to intrude, but there's a man outside asking about a pregnant woman from Boston. Says he's a federal marshal. Samuel and Becca exchanged glances. Samuel stood and straightened his coat, his expression shifting back to professional neutrality. Show him in. The man who entered wore the badge of a U.S. Marshal pinned to his vest. He was perhaps 45, with gray threaded through his dark beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent years in the saddle. Marshal Jacob Hayes. I'm looking for a woman named Rebecca Brennan, also known as Rebecca Quinn. I have reason to believe she's in this area. Becca's hands went cold. Federal marshals did not typically hunt for witnesses. They hunted for criminals. What do you want with her? Samuel asked carefully. Hayes studied both of them with shrewd eyes. I want to keep her alive long enough to testify against Daniel Thornhill, which is going to be difficult if his hired guns find her first. He turned his full attention to Becca. You are Rebecca Quinn, aren't you? Or Brennan, whichever name you prefer. There seemed little point in denial. Becca nodded slowly. Good. Then we need to talk about Daniel Thornhill and the evidence you stole from his office. Evidence that could put him away for 20 years if we can get it admitted at trial. How do you know about that? I've been investigating Thornhill for 18 months. Wire fraud, mail fraud, racketeering. The man's built an empire on forged documents and intimidation. But he's careful. Every trail I follow goes cold. Every witness disappears or recants their testimony. Hayes pulled a chair out and sat down without waiting for invitation. Then 3 months ago, I heard about a secretary who fled Boston after a suspicious fire. A secretary who worked for Thornhill and might have seen things she wasn't supposed to see. I've been tracking you ever since. Becca felt the walls closing in. Too many people knew her secrets. Too many people wanted something from her. I don't have what you think I have. Yes, you do, and I can protect you while you help me build a case. But you need to trust me. Why should I? I don't know you. Hayes leaned back and studied her with something that might have been respect. You shouldn't trust me. Shouldn't trust Cash Dalton either, or Doc Brennan, or anyone who stands to benefit from Daniel Thornhill's downfall. But here's the reality, Miss Quinn. Those men who chased you through the forest last night, they were the best trackers Daniel could hire. If they found you once, they'll find you again. Your only chance is to help us put Daniel somewhere he can't send killers after you. He was right. Becca knew he was right. But accepting his help meant accepting that she would never truly escape Montana, that she would be tied to this place until Daniel's trial concluded, which could take months or years. What do you need from me? Everything you know, every document you have, every conversation you overheard. I'll build it into a case so airtight, even Daniel's lawyers can't wiggle free. Before Becca could respond, the door burst open. Cash Dalton filled the doorframe, his expression dangerous. Hayes, I thought we agreed you'd coordinate through me before approaching witnesses. Your witness was in town. I took the opportunity. My witness is under my protection. You want to talk to her? You do it at my ranch under my supervision. Hayes stood slowly, his hand moving closer to the revolver on his hip. Are you interfering with a federal investigation, Dalton? I'm protecting a pregnant woman from being bullied by an overeager lawman. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. Samuel stepped between them, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Gentlemen, we all want the same thing. Let's not tear each other apart before we've dealt with the real enemy. Cash's jaw worked as he visibly fought for control. Finally, he nodded curtly. Fine. Hayes, you can interview Miss Quinn tomorrow at Dalton Ranch, with myself and Doc Brennan present. Agreed. Hayes tipped his hat to Becca. Until tomorrow, ma'am. And Miss Quinn, those men who chased you last night, one of them survived long enough to talk. Daniel Thornhill didn't just send them to find you, he sent them to kill you. He left before anyone could respond. The silence that followed pressed down like a physical weight. Becca looked at Cash, at Samuel, at Ruby standing wide-eyed in the doorway, all of them staring at her, all of them wanting something. I need air. She pushed past them and out into the bright Montana morning. The main street of Willowbrook stretched before her, ordinary and peaceful. People going about their business, unaware of the murder and conspiracy swirling beneath the surface of their quiet town. Becca walked until she found a bench outside the general store. She sat heavily, one hand on her swollen belly, and tried to organize her racing thoughts. A shadow fell across her. She looked up to find Cash standing there, his expression gentler than it had been in the doctor's office. I'm sorry for Hayes ambushing you like that. I told him to wait. It doesn't matter. He would have found me eventually. Cash sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. You don't have to do this. Don't have to testify or help Hayes build his case. I can get you out of Montana, give you enough money to disappear somewhere. Daniel will never find you. Becca turned to look at him, searching for the trap in this offer. Why would you do that? You need my testimony to get your land back. I need justice, but not at the cost of your life or your child's safety. There are other ways to fight Daniel Thornhill. For the first time since meeting Cash Dalton, Becca felt the ice around her heart crack slightly. His offer seemed genuine. No calculation behind it. Just a man trying to do the right thing, even when it cost him. Thomas Yates was a good man, she said quietly. He died because Daniel Thornhill is evil and powerful and careful. If I run now, Thomas's death means nothing. But if I help destroy Daniel, then maybe Thomas didn't die for nothing. Cash nodded slowly. Revenge is a poor foundation for decisions. But justice, that's different. Justice, I understand. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Becca asked the question that had been haunting her since the forest. Why do you really care about bringing down Daniel? It's not just about land. There's something personal. Cash's expression hardened. My father died 2 years ago. Heart attack, the doctor said. But in his final days he kept talking about Daniel Thornhill, about documents he'd signed without reading carefully, about land he thought he owned, but somehow didn't. He pulled out a small photograph from his vest pocket and handed it to Becca. It showed an older man with Cash's strong jaw and steady eyes standing proudly in front of Dalton Ranch. I found papers after he died, business dealings with Daniel, contracts that gave Daniel mineral rights to half our land for a fraction of their value. My father wouldn't have signed those deals, not unless he was coerced or drugged or tricked. You think Daniel killed your father? I think Daniel destroyed him, broke his spirit until his heart gave out. And I think you and I both have debts we need to collect. Cash took back the photograph and tucked it carefully away. But we collect them the right way, through law and justice, not through becoming the monsters we're fighting. Becca wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that justice was possible. But she had seen too much of Daniel's power, his ability to twist law to his purposes. What if the law isn't enough? Cash met her eyes, and she saw the same cold fury she felt burning in her chest reflected in his winter sky gaze. Then we find another way, but we try the law first. Ruby appeared from the doctor's office, concern etched on her face. Cash, we need to get back to the ranch. One of the hands just rode in. Says there were strangers asking questions at the Larson farm this morning. Cash was on his feet instantly. Henrik and Astrid, were they hurt? No, but the strangers were very interested in whether the Larsons had seen a pregnant woman traveling alone. Becca felt her blood turn to ice. Daniel's men were already spreading their net, questioning everyone within a day's ride of her last known location. It was only a matter of time before they connected her to Cash Dalton. We need to go, Cash said, already moving toward the carriage. Now. The ride back to Dalton Ranch passed in tense silence. Becca watched the landscape roll by and tried to imagine where she could run if Daniel's men found her again. But with each mile she became more certain of a terrible truth. There was nowhere to run. Not anymore. Her only path forward was through Daniel Thornhill, even if that path might lead to her death. They arrived at the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Cash helped Becca from the carriage and gestured toward the house. Go inside. Lock your door. Ruby will bring you dinner. I need to meet with my men and set up a watch rotation. But before they could reach the house, a rider approached from the east, moving at a full gallop. He reined in his horse with expert precision and jumped down before the animal had fully stopped. Boss, we got a problem. There's a man at the gate. Says he's a deputy sheriff from Willowbrook. Says he needs to speak to Rebecca Quinn immediately. Cash's expression turned dangerous. What does he want? Says he has information about Thomas Yates. The name hit Becca like a physical blow. She grabbed Cash's arm to steady herself. Thomas is dead. I saw him die. The rider shook his head. Deputy says otherwise. Says Thomas Yates is alive and working as his assistant. Says he's been searching for Miss Quinn for 8 months. The world tilted sideways. Becca felt her knees buckle, and Cash caught her before she fell. His voice seemed to come from very far away. Becca, stay with me. But all she could hear was her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like drums. All she could see was Thomas's face at the window, surrounded by smoke and flame. All she could feel was the grief she had carried for 8 months like a stone in her chest. Thomas was alive. Thomas had been alive this whole time, and she had been running across a continent, building a new life, preparing to raise his child alone. Thomas was alive. Cash's voice cut through her shock. Bring the deputy to my study. Miss Quinn and I need to have a conversation with him. He looked down at Becca, his expression unreadable. "Are you ready for this?" Becca straightened her spine and wiped her eyes. She had survived Daniel's poison, had survived a fire and betrayal and 8 months of lonely exile. She could survive this revelation. "Yes, I need to know the truth, even if the truth is complicated." Becca thought about everything that had happened since the night she fled Boston, the lies she had told, the identity she had built, the feelings that had begun stirring in her chest when Cash looked at her with those winter sky eyes, especially if it's complicated. Cash nodded and led her into the house, into his study, into whatever revelation waited on the other side of this impossible news. And as they walked, Becca felt the story she had told herself about her life beginning to crumble, making way for a truth she was not sure she was ready to face. The man who entered Cash's study wore a deputy's badge and familiar eyes. Eyes that Becca had dreamed about for 8 months, eyes she thought she would never see again outside of memory. But the man himself was a stranger. Thomas Yates had been soft-spoken and gentle, a man who built bridges and read poetry. The deputy who stood before her carried himself with the hard confidence of someone who had seen violence and learned to survive it. He stopped when he saw her, his expression cycling through shock relief and something darker, anger perhaps, or hurt. "Becca," that voice, that familiar voice speaking her name after so much silence. "Thomas," the word came out as barely a whisper. "They told me you were dead. I nearly was. Daniel's men left me for dead in that fire, but a neighbor pulled me out, took me to a hospital. By the time I recovered enough to search for you, you had vanished." He took a step closer, and Becca saw the burn scars on his left hand, evidence of the fire that had torn their lives apart. "I've been looking for you ever since, following every rumor, every hint. When I heard about a pregnant woman from Boston asking questions in Montana Territory, I knew it had to be you." Thomas's eyes dropped to her swollen belly, and something complicated crossed his face. "Our child—" Becca could only nod, her throat too tight for words. Cash cleared his throat, a reminder that they were not alone in this reunion. "Deputy Yates, I assume Cash Dalton. Miss Quinn is under my protection." Thomas's attention snapped to Cash, and Becca saw recognition dawn. "You're the rancher investigating Daniel Thornhill, the one who contacted Marshal Hayes." "That's right. Then we're on the same side." Thomas turned back to Becca. "I know why you ran, know what you discovered about Daniel, but you don't have to hide anymore. Daniel made a mistake when he tried to kill us. He left witnesses, left evidence, and I've spent 8 months building a case that will put him in prison for the rest of his life." Becca felt torn between joy at seeing Thomas alive and rage at the 8 months of grief she had endured unnecessarily. "Why didn't you find me sooner? Why didn't you send word that you survived?" "I tried, sent letters to everyone we knew in Boston. But Daniel had people watching. Every inquiry I made put you in more danger. The safest thing was to let him think we were both dead while I gathered evidence." Thomas moved closer still, and Becca could smell the familiar scent of his cologne, could see the worry lines that had etched themselves around his eyes. "Becca, I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But we can fix this now, together. We can bring Daniel down and build the life we planned." He reached for her hand, and Becca let him take it. His grip was warm and familiar, and for a moment she was transported back to Boston, to a simpler time when love seemed uncomplicated and the future stretched bright before them. But only for a moment. Because when she looked at Thomas's face, she did not feel the overwhelming relief and joy she had expected. She felt something more complex. Gratitude that he was alive, residual love for the man he had been, but not the all-consuming passion that had driven them together in Boston. 8 months had changed her, had hardened her, had taught her to stand alone. And standing alone, she had started to imagine what it might be like to stand beside someone different, someone with winter sky eyes and a ranch that represented everything Thomas's bridges did not: permanence, roots, a life built from earth instead of steel. She gently pulled her hand from Thomas's grip. I'm glad you're alive, grateful beyond words. But Thomas, we can't just pick up where we left off. Too much has happened. Too much has changed. Pain flashed across Thomas's face. Because of him, he gestured toward Cash. Because some wealthy rancher offered you protection. Because I'm not the same woman you knew in Boston. Because I've spent 8 months learning to survive on my own strength. And because, whether I like it or not, my life is tangled up in Cash Dalton's fight against Daniel Thornhill now. Cash had remained silent during this exchange, but now he spoke quietly. Miss Quinn is free to make her own choices. If she wants to leave with you, Deputy, I won't stop her. Her testimony against Daniel is valuable, but her safety matters more. Thomas turned to Cash with grudging respect. That's surprisingly honorable for a man with your reputation. What reputation would that be? The man who spent 2 years buying up every piece of land Daniel Thornhill ever touched. The man who's bankrupted 3 of Daniel's business partners through perfectly legal but ruthlessly executed competition. You're not just fighting Daniel, you're destroying everything he's built. Cash's smile held no warmth. I prefer to think of it as creative justice. It's revenge, dressed up in legal paperwork, but revenge nonetheless. Perhaps, but it's revenge that follows the law, which makes it better than murder. Thomas studied Cash for a long moment. We're going to have to work together to bring Daniel down. Can you put aside whatever personal feelings you've developed for Becca and focus on the case? The question hung in the air like smoke. Becca found herself holding her breath, waiting for Cash's answer, wondering if he would acknowledge the tension that had been building between them. The looks that lasted too long, the accidental touches that felt deliberate. But Cash's expression remained neutral. My feelings are irrelevant. Miss Quinn's safety and testimony are what matter. If working with you ensures both those things, then we'll work together. He moved toward the door, then paused. But Deputy Yates, understand this. Becca Quinn makes her own choices. She always has. If you try to pressure or manipulate her into anything, you'll answer to me. Cash left before Thomas could respond. The silence he left behind felt oppressive. Thomas turned back to Becca, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. What happened between you two? Nothing, Becca said, and realized it was both truth and lie. Nothing had happened, but something was happening, something she did not fully understand and was not ready to name. Becca, I love you. I've loved you since the day we met. None of that has changed. Everything has changed, Thomas. We've both changed. And I need time to understand who I am now before I can figure out what we might be to each other. Thomas looked as if he wanted to argue, but something in Becca's expression must have convinced him to wait. He nodded slowly. All right. Time. But Becca, whatever else happens, promise me you'll be careful around Cash Dalton. Men like him collect debts, and sometimes the price they charge is higher than you realize. After Thomas left, Becca stood alone in Cash's study and tried to sort through the chaos of her emotions. Thomas was alive. The father of her child had returned from the dead. She should have been overjoyed. Instead, she felt trapped between 2 futures. The life she had planned with Thomas, now possible again. And the life she had begun building here in this unlikely place with a man who looked at her as if she were strong rather than fragile. The baby kicked hard as if offering its own opinion on the matter. Becca pressed her hand to her belly and whispered a promise. I'll figure this out. I'll make the right choice. I'll keep you safe. But as she spoke the words, she wondered which path truly led to safety. The familiar comfort of Thomas's love, or the dangerous appeal of Cash Dalton's complicated alliance. Outside, the Montana sun sank toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. And somewhere to the east, Daniel Thornhill's hunters drew closer, following a trail that would lead them inevitably to Dalton Ranch. The storm was coming. Becca could feel it in her bones. And when it arrived, she would need to choose not just between 2 men, but between 2 versions of herself. The woman she had been in Boston, defined by love and trust. Or the woman Montana had forged from survival and strength. The choice would come soon. But tonight Becca allowed herself the luxury of uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tonight she simply existed in the space between past and future, holding the weight of an impossible decision in her hands like a stone that could either anchor or drown her. October arrived in Montana with the promise of winter hiding in every gust of wind. The aspen trees turned gold against the evergreen backdrop of pine and spruce. Mornings began with frost that melted by noon, leaving the ground damp and rich with the smell of dying vegetation preparing for snow. Becca established a routine at Dalton Ranch that kept her hands busy and her mind distracted from impossible choices. She rose before dawn and worked in Ruby's office, reconciling accounts by lamplight while the house slept around her. The numbers made sense in ways that human emotions did not. Debits and credits, profit and loss, the simple mathematics of ranching that required no interpretation or heart-searching. Ruby had accepted Becca's offer of help with surprising grace. She spent her mornings teaching Becca the intricacies of ranch bookkeeping, then disappeared into town for longer and longer periods. Becca suspected these absences had more to do with Dr. Brennan than any urgent social obligations, but she kept her observations private. Cash maintained a careful distance. He appeared at breakfast and dinner, courteous and remote, discussing ranch business with the same professional detachment he might show a hired accountant. He asked after her health and the baby's well-being with genuine concern, but no intimacy. He treated her like a valued employee rather than the woman he had rescued from certain death. Becca told herself this was preferable, safer, less complicated. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. Thomas visited 3 times a week, riding out from Willowbrook with the dogged persistence of a man who believed time and proximity would eventually wear down her resistance. He brought gifts for the baby, small things, carefully chosen. A carved wooden rattle, soft blankets knitted by women in town who had heard about the deputy's lost love. A children's book with illustrations of animals that made Becca's heart ache with their innocence. He spoke of their future with absolute certainty, the house they would build, the life they would share once Daniel was behind bars. He painted pictures with words detailed and domestic, as if speaking them aloud would make them inevitable. Becca listened and smiled and felt increasingly like a fraud. Because when Thomas left and she returned to the account books in Ruby's office, she found herself watching the window for Cash's return from the far pastures, found herself memorizing the rhythm of his footsteps in the hallway, found herself lying awake at night, wondering what it would feel like if those careful hands that gentled horses and mended fences ever touched her with intention rather than necessity. This was dangerous territory. Becca knew better than to mistake protection for affection, gratitude for love. Cash Dalton had made his position clear. She was a witness, a means to an end. His courteous distance proved he felt nothing beyond professional obligation, but knowing this did not stop her heart from quickening when he entered a room, did not stop her from noticing the way lamplight caught the planes of his face, did not stop her from imagining futures that had no place in her reality. The first snow fell on an afternoon in late October. Becca stood at the window of Ruby's office and watched fat flakes drift past the glass, settling on the ground with the quiet certainty of winter claiming its territory. Behind her, account books lay open, but the numbers had lost their power to distract. A knock at the door made her turn. Cash stood in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow, his expression carefully neutral. "Henrik Larson is here to see you. Says it's urgent." Becca's stomach clenched with sudden dread. Henrik and his wife Astrid had been the closest thing to neighbors during her months building the cabin. They had offered quiet kindness without prying questions, bringing food and supplies with the understanding that some stories were not ready to be told. Did he say what he wants? No, but he looks worried. Cash led her to the front parlor where Henrik waited with his hat clutched in weathered hands. The old Swede's face was creased with concern that deepened when he saw Becca. "Miss Quinn, forgive the intrusion, but I must speak with you, privately." Cash made no move to leave. "Anything that concerns Miss Quinn's safety concerns me." Henrik glanced between them, some internal calculation visible in his pale eyes. Finally he nodded. "Very well, you should both know. There was a man at my farm yesterday, well-dressed, spoke with educated accent. He asked many questions about you, Miss Quinn." Becca felt the blood drain from her face. What kind of questions? When you arrived, where you came from, whether you had visitors, whether you seemed afraid of anything. Henrik's grip tightened on his hat. "I told him nothing useful, said you kept to yourself, said I rarely saw you." "Did he give a name?" "Yes. He said he was your husband, Daniel Thornhill. Said he was very worried about you and the baby. Said you were not well when you left Boston, and he only wanted to make sure you were safe." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Daniel was here. Not just his hired killers, but Daniel himself, coming to Montana with his respectable lies and dangerous charm. Cash's hand found her elbow, steadying her. "Did you believe him?" Henrik met Cash's gaze directly. "I am old Mr. Dalton, but not foolish. A husband worried for his sick wife does not send armed men ahead of him, does not offer money for information about her whereabouts. I saw Miss Quinn build that cabin alone, saw the strength in her. Whatever story this Thornhill tells, I do not believe she ran from kindness." Relief washed through Becca so powerfully her knees weakened. "Thank you, Henrik, for not telling him anything. I came to warn you, and to say if you need a place to hide Astrid, and I have a root cellar. It is not comfortable, but it is invisible from the road." "That won't be necessary," Cash said, his voice carrying an edge Becca had not heard before. "Miss Quinn is under my protection. Daniel Thornhill can come here if he wants to speak with her. He'll find it less pleasant than he expects." After Henrik left, promising to send word if Daniel appeared again, Cash paced the parlor with barely contained energy. Becca recognized the signs of a man calculating strategy, running through scenarios and contingencies. "We need to move faster," he said finally. "Hayes needs to make his arrest before Daniel has time to establish himself here, before he can start using his lawyers and influence to muddy the waters. Hayes said he needed more evidence, that my journal and the letter aren't enough. Then we get him more evidence. Doc Brennan has been researching Daniel's business dealings. He may have found connections we can use." Cash stopped pacing and looked at Becca directly. "Are you prepared for what comes next? For testifying in court? For facing Daniel in public?" Becca thought about the nights she still woke gasping from dreams of fire and smoke. Thought about the constant low-grade fear that had become her companion since fleeing Boston. Thought about the child growing inside her, innocent and deserving of a world where monsters could not walk freely. "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to stop him." "Good, because I'm calling a meeting tomorrow. You meet Thomas Doc Brennan and Marshall Hayes. We're going to coordinate our evidence and plan our approach. No more working in isolation. No more secrets." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Becca, you should know. If Daniel comes to this ranch, I won't let him take you. Not peacefully, not legally, not at all. You'd be breaking the law. I'd be protecting someone who deserves protection. The law can catch up later." He left before Becca could respond, but his words echoed in the empty parlor. Cash Dalton, who spoke so carefully about justice and legal methods, was prepared to defy both if necessary. The knowledge should have frightened her. Instead, it kindled something warm and dangerous in her chest. That night, Becca could not sleep. She lay in her borrowed bed, watching moonlight paint shadows on the ceiling, and tried to untangle the complicated knot of her emotions. Thomas represented safety and familiarity, the life she had planned before everything fell apart. Choosing him meant choosing the known, the tested, the love that had already proved itself. But Cash represented something altogether different. Not safety, but strength. Not familiarity, but possibility. Not the life she had planned, but the life she might build if she were brave enough to reach for it. Near midnight, she gave up on sleep and wrapped herself in a shawl. The house was silent as she made her way downstairs, seeking the kitchen and perhaps warm milk to quiet her racing thoughts. But the kitchen was not empty. Cash sat at the large wooden table, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass before him. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Can't sleep. The baby has decided my ribs make excellent drums." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Sit. I'll make you something that might help." He moved to the stove and began heating milk with practiced efficiency. Becca watched, fascinated by the domestic competence of this man who commanded a ranch and faced down federal marshals with equal ease. "You're good at this, taking care of people." "Had practice. My mother died when I was 12. Ruby was only 5. Our father did his best, but he was better with cattle than children. I learned to cook, to mend clothes, to braid Ruby's hair, even though I had no idea what I was doing." He poured the warm milk into a cup and added honey, stirring slowly. "People think money solves everything, that being wealthy means being free from ordinary struggles, but Ruby still needed someone to read her bedtime stories, still cried when she had nightmares. Money couldn't fix loneliness or grief." He handed her the cup, and their fingers brushed in the transfer. The contact lasted barely a second, but Becca felt it like an electric current. "Is that why you help people, the orphan boy Ruby mentioned? The widow? Me? Because you remember what it's like to need help." Cash sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm trying to build something my father never managed, a legacy that matters more than land and cattle." "He'd be proud of you, of what you've built here. Would he?" "I've spent 2 years systematically destroying Daniel Thornhill's business empire. I've bought up properties at inflated prices just to keep them out of his hands. I've convinced his partners to abandon deals by making them better offers. Some people would call that vindictive. Some people would call it justice. And you, what would you call it?" Becca sipped the warm milk, considering. "I'd call it a man who understands that sometimes the law moves too slowly to prevent more suffering, who knows that waiting for perfect justice means watching more people get hurt." Cash studied her face in the lamplight. "You've changed since you first arrived. When you stepped out of that forest, you looked like you expected the world to strike you down at any moment. Now you look like you're ready to strike back. Montana has a way of making you harder, stronger. I spent 8 months building a cabin with my own hands, learning to survive on determination when resources ran out. I'm not the same woman who fled Boston." "No, you're not." Something in his voice made Becca's pulse quicken. "That woman was a victim. You're a survivor." The silence that followed felt charged with unspoken words. Becca set down her cup, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how close. How easy it would be to lean forward and discover if the tension between them was mutual attraction or her own desperate imagination. "I should go back to bed." "Becca, wait." She paused halfway to standing. Cash reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "Whatever happens with Daniel, whatever you decide about Thomas, I want you to know something. You don't owe anyone your future. Not me, not Thomas, not gratitude or obligation or some misguided sense of duty. You've earned the right to choose for yourself." Becca looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between his scarred knuckles and her work-roughened fingers. Two people who had learned to survive through labor and determination. "What if I don't know what I want?" "Then you take time to figure it out, and anyone who tries to rush you can answer to me." He released her hand, and Becca felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. She climbed the stairs to her room and lay awake until dawn, the warmth of his touch still burning on her skin. The meeting Cash called took place in his study the following afternoon. They gathered like conspirators, each bringing pieces of a puzzle that might finally reveal Daniel Thornhill's complete picture of corruption. Marshal Hayes arrived first, carrying a leather satchel thick with documents. Dr. Brennan came next, his medical bag replaced by folders of carefully researched evidence. Thomas appeared last, his deputy badge catching the lamplight, his expression guarded when he saw how close Becca sat to Cash's desk. Ruby attended as well, her presence explained by her role as ranch bookkeeper, but Becca suspected the real reason was Dr. Brennan, whose eyes followed Ruby's movements with poorly disguised longing. Hayes spread papers across Cash's desk, creating a map of crime that stretched from Boston to Montana Territory. I've been tracking Daniel Thornhill for 18 months. Started with mail fraud, expanded into wire fraud and racketeering. The pattern is consistent. He identifies wealthy landowners, particularly older men without strong family connections. He befriends them, earns their trust. Then he manipulates them into signing documents they don't fully understand. Hayes pulled out a stack of contracts, each bearing different signatures. These are mineral rights agreements, land transfers, business partnerships. Every one gives Thornhill significant financial benefit while providing minimal compensation to the original owner, and in every case the person who signed died within 3 years. Heart attack, stroke, sudden illness. "You think he's poisoning them," Becca said quietly. "I think he's found ways to accelerate natural death. Laudanum to weaken hearts. Arsenic in small doses to cause organ failure. Nothing dramatic enough to raise immediate suspicion." Doc Brennan leaned forward, his expression intense. "I've been reviewing death certificates from Boston going back 10 years, cross-referencing them with Daniel's known business associates. The pattern is unmistakable. Men who do business with Daniel Thornhill die at 3 times the expected rate for their age and health status." He pulled out his own documents, medical records, annotated with careful notes. "Your father, Cash. Did he complain of stomach pains in the months before his death? Difficulty sleeping? Unexplained weakness?" Cash's jaw tightened. "All of those. The doctor said it was stress from ranching, old age catching up. It was poison. Slow and careful, but poison nonetheless. I found laudanum in the medicine bottles recovered from your father's room after his death, far more than any responsible physician would prescribe." The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Cash stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back rigid with controlled fury. Becca spoke into the silence. "I have my journal, 2 years of observations, dates, times, people Daniel met with, conversations I overheard. It's not proof by itself, but it establishes a pattern that corroborates what you've found." She pulled the small leather notebook from her pocket and placed it on the desk. Hayes reached for it immediately, flipping through pages covered in Becca's neat handwriting. "This is remarkable, detailed, specific." He looked up at Becca with new respect. "You documented everything, even things you might not have known were significant at the time." "I knew Daniel was dangerous. I just didn't know how to prove it, so I wrote down everything hoping that someday the pieces would fit together." Thomas moved closer to the desk, his expression conflicted. "Becca, when did you start keeping this journal, before or after we began courting?" "Before. 6 months before we met." "So you knew what Daniel was, what he was capable of. And you never told me—" The accusation in his voice stung. Becca met his gaze steadily. "I told you when I was ready, when I thought we could do something about it together. And we tried. And he nearly killed us both. If you'd told me earlier, we could have been more careful, could have planned better. Or he would have killed us earlier." Becca's voice hardened. "Don't blame me for not trusting quickly enough when my caution is what kept us alive as long as it did." Ruby's quiet voice cut through the tension. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should focus on the evidence, rather than assigning blame for the past." Hayes nodded agreement. "Miss Dalton is right. We have documentation of pattern. We have death certificates suggesting poisoning. We have testimony from Miss Quinn about Daniel's methods. What we still need is direct proof, something that connects Daniel to a specific crime in a way no lawyer can dismiss." "I have something," Becca said quietly. She reached into her boot and withdrew the folded letter she had shown Doc Brennan. "This is Daniel's handwriting requesting laudanum be prescribed in my name. It proves he planned to drug me. to make me appear unstable." Hayes read the letter 3 times, his expression growing darker. "This is good, very good. But a skilled lawyer will argue it's forgery, that you created it to support your accusations. Then we need a handwriting expert to verify it's genuine," Cash said, turning from the window. "We need someone who can testify under oath that this is Daniel Thornhill's handwriting." "I can do better than that," Thomas interjected. "I have letters Daniel sent to my engineering firm in Boston, business correspondence about bridge construction. We can compare the handwriting, prove they're from the same person." He pulled an envelope from his coat, clearly prepared for this moment. Hayes examined both documents side by side, and even Becca could see the similarities. The distinctive way Daniel formed his capital T, the sharp angle of his lowercase g. "This works," Hayes said with satisfaction. "With the journal, the medical evidence, and handwriting verification, we can build a case. It won't be easy. Daniel has resources and connections, but it's possible." Cash returned to the desk, his expression determined. "How long until you can make an arrest? I need to take all this evidence to the federal prosecutor in Helena. Get formal approval for the warrant. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Daniel is already in Montana. We don't have 3 weeks." Hayes met Cash's gaze with the steady calm of a man who had faced desperate situations before. "Then we move faster. I'll leave for Helena tomorrow. Push the prosecutor to expedite the process. But you need to keep Miss Quinn safe in the meantime. If Daniel realizes how much evidence we've gathered, he'll do whatever it takes to silence her. He won't get near her." The absolute certainty in Cash's voice sent a shiver down Becca's spine. This was not the careful, law-abiding rancher speaking. This was something more primal, more dangerous. Thomas noticed it too. "Dalton, don't do anything foolish. We're close to bringing Daniel down through legal means. Don't throw that away by turning this into a personal vendetta. I won't start the fight, but if Daniel brings violence to my door, I'll finish it." The meeting concluded with Hayes gathering all the evidence to take to Helena. Ruby offered to make copies of the most critical documents, a task that would keep her and Doc Brennan working late into the night. Their eyes met as she made the suggestion, and Becca saw the unspoken communication between them. As the group dispersed, Thomas caught Becca's arm. "Can we talk privately?" Cash looked like he wanted to object, but Becca nodded. They walked out to the veranda, where early snow had begun to accumulate on the railing. Thomas stood close enough that Becca could see her reflection in his eyes. "I'm trying to understand, trying to be patient, but Becca, I love you. I've loved you since the day we met, and watching you pull away, watching you look at Cash Dalton with those eyes, it's killing me. Thomas, I never promised I could just pick up where we left off. I know that. But I need to know if there's still a chance, if you still feel anything for me beyond gratitude that I'm alive." Becca thought about the question carefully, respecting Thomas enough to give him honesty, even when it hurt. "I care about you. Part of me will always love the man you were in Boston, the man who made me laugh and read poetry and believed we could fix the world together. But I'm not the woman who fell in love with that man anymore. I've changed. And I don't know if the person I've become fits with the person you are now." Thomas's hands clenched at his sides. "Because of him. Because of Cash Dalton and his money and his ranch and his noble promises to protect you. Because of me. Because I spent 8 months learning to stand alone. And now I'm not sure I want to lean on anyone, even someone I once loved. That's fear talking. Fear that you'll be hurt again. But Becca, I'm not Daniel. I won't betray you or manipulate you or try to control you. I know you won't. That's not the issue." Then what is? Becca struggled to find words for feelings she barely understood herself. "The issue is that I need to choose my future based on who I am now, not who I was 8 months ago. And right now I don't know who that person is yet." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, snow beginning to settle on his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice carried resignation. "I'll wait, as long as it takes. But Becca, please don't let Cash Dalton's wealth and power blind you to what's real. He's using this situation to get what he wants. When Daniel is gone and the trial is over, will he still want you? Or will you just be another problem he solved? The words hit harder than Thomas probably intended, because Becca had asked herself the same question 100 times. What happened when she was no longer a witness, no longer necessary to Cash's plans? Would his careful protection evaporate like morning frost in sunshine? She had no answer to give Thomas, so she gave him silence instead. He touched her shoulder briefly, then left his footsteps, crunching through fresh snow, toward his waiting horse. Becca remained on the veranda watching snow fall in the gathering darkness. Behind her, through the window, she could see Cash in his study reviewing documents by lamplight. He looked up as if sensing her gaze, and for a moment their eyes met through the glass. Neither moved. Neither looked away. The snow continued falling, and Becca felt as if she stood at a crossroads where every path led to uncertainty and every choice carried consequences she could not fully foresee. The sound of approaching horses broke the spell, multiple riders coming fast from the east. Cash was at the door in seconds, his hand on the revolver at his hip. A ranch hand galloped up to the house, his expression urgent. "Boss, there's a group approaching the main gate. 6 men, well-dressed. Leading horse carries a man who says his name is Daniel Thornhill, and he's here to see his wife." Becca's blood turned to ice. "Daniel, here, now." Cash's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous. "How long until they reach the house?" 10 minutes, maybe less. Gather the men. Full defensive positions. No one fires unless I give the order, but be ready." The ranch hand rode off, and Cash turned to Becca. "Get inside. Lock yourself in your room. Don't come out until I say it's safe." "No." Becca's voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I'm not hiding while you face him. Daniel is my fight as much as yours. Becca, this is exactly what he wants. To see you. To manipulate you. To find some weakness he can exploit." "Then let him try. I'm not the terrified secretary anymore. I'm the woman who survived his poison and his fire and 8 months of exile. Let him see what he created." Cash looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Becca's expression must have convinced him. "All right. But you stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" "Understood." They stood together on the veranda watching 6 horses materialize from the swirling snow. The lead rider was instantly recognizable. Daniel Thornhill sat his horse with practiced ease, dressed in an expensive coat that spoke of Boston tailors and old money. His face was exactly as Becca remembered. Handsome in a classical way, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The kind smile that had fooled so many people into trusting him. Behind him, 5 men rode in formation, not cowboys, professional guards, their hands resting on visible weapons. Daniel reined in his horse at the base of the veranda steps. His smile widened when he saw Becca. "Rebecca, my dear, I've been so worried about you. When you disappeared so suddenly, I feared the worst." His voice was smooth, concerned, perfectly pitched to suggest a loving employer distraught over a missing employee. Becca felt rage rise in her throat, like bile. "You tried to kill me." Daniel's expression shifted to wounded confusion. "Kill you?" "My dear girl, what poison has been dripped in your ears? I've done nothing but try to help you. Even now, I've traveled all this way to ensure you're being properly cared for, by sending armed men to hunt me through the forest. Armed men. Rebecca, I sent investigators to find you, to make sure you were safe. If they frightened you, I sincerely apologize. But their intentions were purely protective." He was good. So good at this performance of injured innocence. Becca could see how he had fooled judges and juries and everyone who had ever trusted him. Cash stepped forward, positioning himself between Becca and Daniel. "Your wife has made it clear she doesn't want your protection, Thornhill. You need to leave. And you are Cash Dalton, owner of this ranch, and the man telling you that you're not welcome here." Daniel studied Cash with calculating interest. "Ah, yes, the rancher who's been making inquiries about my business dealings. I wondered when we'd meet." His smile grew colder. "You should be careful, Mr. Dalton. Powerful men don't appreciate having their affairs examined too closely. And killers don't appreciate having their crimes exposed. But here we are. The tension ratcheted higher. Daniel's guards shifted in their saddles' hands, moving closer to weapons. Around the ranch yard, Cash's men emerged from barns and bunkhouses, rifles held ready, but not aimed. Daniel raised one hand in a placating gesture. "Gentlemen, there is no need for violence. I'm simply here to speak with Rebecca, to ensure she's being treated well and has everything she needs." "I have everything I need," Becca said, her voice carrying across the snow, "and I don't want to speak with you. Ever." "Rebecca, please, be reasonable. You're pregnant and far from home. You need proper medical care, a stable environment. I can provide those things. You can provide poison and manipulation and death. That's all you've ever provided anyone." Daniel's mask slipped slightly. Just for a second, Becca saw the cold fury beneath the concerned smile. Then it was gone, replaced by patient understanding. "I see you've been listening to malicious rumors, people who don't understand our relationship, who want to turn you against me for their own purposes." His gaze shifted to Cash. "People like Mr. Dalton, who needs your testimony to support his baseless accusations against me. My accusations aren't baseless, and soon they'll be backed by federal warrants." Daniel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Federal warrants based on what evidence? The ravings of a mentally unstable woman. The jealous vendetta of a rancher who lost a business deal. Based on 2 years of documented evidence," Becca said. "Every crime you committed, every person you poisoned, every life you destroyed. It's all there, Daniel, in my handwriting, with dates and details and proof." For the first time, genuine surprise crossed Daniel's face. "You kept records. I kept everything. And soon Marshal Hayes will deliver it all to a federal prosecutor who doesn't accept bribes." The mask shattered completely. Daniel's expression turned ugly, all pretense of concern evaporating like morning mist. "You stupid girl! Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've cost me? No more than you cost Thomas Yates, or my child's future, or all the people you've murdered over the years." Daniel dismounted in one fluid motion, his guards following suit. Cash's hand went to his revolver, but Daniel held up both hands, showing they were empty. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to make you an offer, Rebecca. One last chance to be reasonable. I don't make deals with murderers. Everyone makes deals when the price is right." Daniel pulled an envelope from his coat and held it up. "Inside this envelope are 2 documents. The first is a legal affidavit stating that you suffered a mental breakdown while in my employ, that you became delusional and paranoid, making wild accusations against me before disappearing. It's signed by 3 prominent Boston physicians. Physicians you bribed or threatened. Physicians whose testimony will destroy any credibility you have in court. But there's a second document, a bank draft for $50,000, enough money to raise your child comfortably anywhere you choose, to build whatever life you want, far from Montana and Boston, and all these unpleasant complications." He took a step closer, and Cash moved to block him. Daniel smiled at the protective gesture. "All you have to do is sign a statement saying you made a mistake, that you misunderstood certain business transactions, that you were emotionally unstable after a failed romance and made accusations you now retract. Sign that, take the money, and disappear. I'll never bother you again." "And if I refuse," Daniel's smile turned vicious, "then I'll make sure every person you care about suffers, starting with the father of your child. Thomas Yates escaped my fire once. He won't be so lucky next time." Cash drew his revolver in one smooth motion, the barrel pointing at Daniel's chest. "You just threatened a federal officer. That alone is enough to arrest you." "Did I don't recall making any threats. Do any of you men recall hearing threats?" Daniel glanced at his guards, who all shook their heads in unison. "See, just a friendly conversation, a generous offer that Miss Quinn is free to accept or decline." He placed the envelope on the veranda railing, his movements deliberately slow. "Think about it, Rebecca. Think about whether your pride is worth the lives of everyone in this ranch. Because if you persist in this vendetta, I will burn Dalton Ranch to the ground with everyone inside. And unlike Boston, I'll make sure there are no survivors this time." He remounted his horse with practiced ease. "You have 3 days to decide. After that, my generosity expires." Daniel and his men rode back into the snow, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Cash kept his revolver drawn until they were out of sight, then slowly lowered it. Becca remained frozen on the veranda, her mind reeling from the encounter. Daniel had shown his true face, had revealed just how far he would go to protect his empire of corruption, and he had made one thing terribly clear. This would not end with arrests and trials and orderly justice. This would end in blood. The only question was whose. 3 days passed like the slow drip of water wearing away stone. Cash doubled the guards around the ranch perimeter and forbade anyone from traveling alone beyond the main gates. The ranch hands moved through their duties with rifles slung across their backs, eyes scanning the horizon for threats that might emerge from the Montana landscape. Becca spent those days in a strange, suspended state, waiting for Daniel to make his next move while trying to maintain the illusion of normal life. She worked on the account books in Ruby's office, but the numbers swam before her eyes, refusing to resolve into meaningful patterns. She ate meals she could not taste. She smiled at Ruby's attempts at conversation and heard none of the words. At night she lay awake, listening to footsteps in the hallway as guards patrolled the house. Cash had stationed 2 men outside her door at all times. Their presence should have been reassuring. Instead, it reminded her constantly that she was prey waiting for the hunter to strike. Thomas visited every day, his deputy badge catching lamplight as he shared what little information Marshal Hayes had sent from Helena. The federal prosecutor was reviewing the evidence, building the case, moving through the careful bureaucratic machinery that would eventually produce an arrest warrant. Eventually, but not yet, not in time. On the 3rd night, Becca gave up on sleep entirely and made her way downstairs to the kitchen. The house was dark except for a lamp burning in Cash's study. She moved toward the light like a moth drawn by the promise of company in the lonely hours before dawn. Cash sat at his desk, surrounded by maps and documents, a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. He looked up when she entered, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. "You should be resting. The baby needs you healthy." "The baby seems to prefer keeping me awake." Becca settled into the chair across from his desk. "What are you working on? Contingency plans. Escape routes if Daniel attacks the ranch. Places to hide you if his men breach our defenses." He gestured at the map spread before him. "I've identified 3 locations within a day's ride. Remote cabins that Daniel wouldn't know about. Places you could stay until Hayes arrives with that warrant." "You're planning to send me away." "I'm planning to keep you alive." Becca studied the map, seeing the careful calculations behind each marked location. Cash had thought through scenarios and probabilities with the thoroughness of a military commander. But beneath the strategic planning, she recognized something else. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. "What if I don't want to hide anymore?" Cash looked up from his map, surprise crossing his face. "Becca, this isn't about what you want. It's about survival." "No, it's about choices, and I'm choosing not to run again." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. "I spent 8 months building a cabin alone because I was tired of being afraid, tired of letting Daniel control my life through fear. If I hide now, he wins. Even if Hayes arrests him later, Daniel wins because he made me run." Being brave and being dead are not the same thing. Neither are being careful and being alive. They stared at each other across the desk, the lamplight casting their shadows long against the wall. Finally, Cash spoke quietly. "I can't lose you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Becca's heart hammered against her ribs. "You can't lose what you don't have." "Can't I?" Cash stood and moved around the desk, stopping close enough that Becca could see the gold flecks in his eyes, pale as January sky over snow. "I know what I promised. Professional distance, no complications, protection without attachment. But Becca, I've watched you transform from a frightened refugee into a woman who faces down killers on her own veranda. I've watched you work until your hands bled to prove you weren't charity. I've watched you grow strong and fierce and absolutely terrifying in your courage. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not move, his hand cupped her face with surprising gentleness. And somewhere in all that watching, I fell in love with you. Becca's breath caught in her throat. She had imagined this moment 100 times in the sleepless hours of the past weeks, had rehearsed her response, planned what she would say. But now, with Cash's hand warm against her cheek and his gaze holding hers, with the intensity of mountain frost, all her prepared words evaporated. Cash, I'm carrying another man's child. I'm legally married to a monster. I'm wanted for testimony in a federal case. I'm the worst possible person for you to love. I know all that. Don't care about any of it. Thomas is alive. He wants to build a life with me. He has a right to expect that. Thomas has a right to ask. You have a right to say no. Cash's thumb traced her cheekbone with exquisite care. But I won't pressure you, won't demand answers you're not ready to give. I just needed you to know. Before whatever happens next, before Daniel makes his move and everything goes to hell, I needed you to know that you are loved, truly, completely, without conditions or expectations. Becca closed her eyes, feeling tears slip free despite her best efforts. This is the worst possible timing. Agreed. But feelings don't wait for convenient moments. Before Becca could respond, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet night. Cash's hand dropped from her face, moving instantly to the revolver at his hip. More sounds followed. Shouting. Gunfire. The thunder of horses approaching at full gallop. Cash grabbed Becca's arm and pulled her toward the door. The safe room, now! What's happening? Daniel's making his move. They ran through the darkened house, Cash's grip steady on her elbow as he navigated by memory. Behind them, more gunfire erupted, the ranch hands returning fire. The organized chaos of men following the defensive plans Cash had drilled into them. Cash pulled open a door that Becca had assumed was a closet. Inside stairs descended into darkness. He guided her down, one hand on her back, moving with urgent care for her pregnant belly. The safe room proved to be a fortified cellar built into the foundation of the house. Thick stone walls, a heavy door with iron reinforcement, supplies stacked in the corners, water, food, weapons. Cash lit a lamp and the room sprang into focus. Ruby was already there, a rifle cradled in her arms with disturbing competence. Doc Brennan stood beside her, his medical bag at his feet. "How bad?" Cash asked. "At least a dozen riders," Doc replied. "Maybe more. They're trying to draw the men away from the house with feints at the barns." Cash moved to a narrow window that looked out onto the ranch yard. Becca joined him, peering through the slit at chaos illuminated by burning torches. Daniel's men had surrounded the ranch buildings, professional and coordinated in their assault. They were not trying to kill Cash's men. They were hurting them, creating openings, looking for weaknesses, looking for her. "They'll breach the house within 20 minutes, Cash said, his voice clinical despite the violence unfolding outside. "Doc, you stay here with the women. Shoot anyone who comes through that door who isn't me or one of my men." "Where are you going?" "To buy you time. If Daniel wants Becca, he has to go through me first." Becca grabbed Cash's arm as he moved toward the stairs. "You can't go out there. They'll kill you." "They'll try, but I'm harder to kill than I look." He covered her hand with his, squeezing gently. "Becca, listen to me. If I don't come back, Doc knows the location of those safe houses I marked on the maps. Get to one of them. Wait for Hayes. Testify against Daniel, and then disappear. Build that life you came to Montana searching for. Cash, please." He kissed her forehead, a gesture of such tenderness it made her chest ache. "I love you. Remember that whatever happens next." Then he was gone, taking the stairs two at a time, leaving Becca standing in the lamplit cellar with tears streaming down her face. Ruby moved to her side, the rifle steady in her hands. "He'll be all right. Cash has survived worse." "Like what?" Like the winter our father died and we had nothing but determination between us and starvation. Like the spring floods that nearly washed away the entire ranch. Like every challenge Montana has thrown at him for the past 10 years. Ruby's voice held absolute certainty. My brother is stubborn and mean when cornered. Daniel Thornhill is about to learn that the hard way. Above them, the battle intensified. Gunfire, shouting, the crash of splintering wood. Becca paced the small cellar like a caged animal, her hands pressed to her swollen belly as the baby kicked in protest at her racing heart. Doc Brennan checked his medical supplies with methodical calm, preparing for casualties with the detachment of someone who had seen battlefield injuries before. "Were you a military doctor?" Becca asked, needing conversation to distract from the violence overhead. "Field surgeon during the Indian Wars. Saw things that still wake me up some nights. But the experience taught me to stay calm when everything goes to hell." He looked up at her, sympathy in his eyes. "This will be over soon, one way or another." The cellar door burst open. Becca spun her heart in her throat, but the man who descended was one of Cash's ranch hands, bleeding from a cut above his eye. "Miss Quinn, you need to come with me, now." "What's wrong?" "Where's Cash?" "Boss said to get you to the north pasture. There's a horse waiting. You ride hard for the Larson farm and don't look back." "I'm not leaving without Cash." The ranch hand grabbed her arm, his grip urgent. "Ma'am, with respect, the boss gave me direct orders. If the house is compromised, I get you out. That's my only job." Ruby stepped between them, her rifle now pointed at the ranch hand. "Tom, I've known you for 6 years. You're loyal to my brother, so why are you suddenly taking orders that contradict his entire defensive plan?" Tom's expression shifted. The urgency in his eyes transformed into something colder. "Because Daniel Thornhill pays better than Cash Dalton ever did." He drew his revolver in one smooth motion, but Ruby was faster. Her rifle barked once, and Tom crumpled to the floor, his gun clattering away across the stones. Doc Brennan moved immediately to check the fallen man, pressing fingers to his neck. "Alive. Shoulder wound. He'll stand trial with the rest of Daniel's men." He began binding the wound with practiced efficiency while Ruby kept her rifle trained on the stairs. "There will be others. Tom wasn't the only one Daniel bought." As if summoned by her words, 2 more men appeared at the top of the stairs. Not ranch hands this time. Professional killers with cold eyes and practiced movements. "Miss Quinn, Mr. Thornhill would like a word. You can come quietly, or we can make this unpleasant." Becca looked at Ruby, at Doc Brennan, at the narrow space that offered nowhere to hide. The baby kicked again, hard enough to make her gasp. "If I go with you, you leave them alone." "Becca, no," Ruby hissed. "Those are acceptable terms," the lead killer said. "Mr. Thornhill only wants you. The others are irrelevant." Becca moved toward the stairs, ignoring Ruby's protests. Doc Brennan tried to block her path, but she shook her head. "Let me go. This is my fight, always has been." The killers grabbed her arms and hauled her up the stairs, through the ransacked house, out into the snow-covered yard. Becca saw Cash's men scattered across the grounds, subdued or unconscious. Saw Daniel's hired guns standing guard with professional efficiency, and there, standing in the center of the chaos, like a conductor before an orchestra, stood Daniel Thornhill. He had traded his expensive coat for something more practical, but his smile remained as cold and calculating as ever. "Rebecca, my dear, I'm so glad you decided to be reasonable. Where's Cash?" "Mr. Dalton proved stubbornly resistant to negotiation. He's currently indisposed." Daniel gestured, and 2 of his men dragged a figure forward. Cash was bloodied, but conscious, his hands bound behind his back. When he saw Becca, fury blazed in his eyes. "Let her go, Thornhill. This is between you and me." "On the contrary, this has always been about Rebecca." Daniel moved closer to Becca, his hand reaching out to touch her belly. She flinched away, but his hired guns held her in place. "Such a waste. All this trouble over a secretary who couldn't mind her own business. If you'd simply accepted your role, Rebecca, none of this would have been necessary." My role as what, your victim? Your role as someone who knew her place in the world, who understood that powerful men do what they must to maintain their position. Daniel's hand settled on her belly, and Becca felt revulsion crawl across her skin. But you had to be difficult, had to play detective, had to convince yourself you were some kind of hero. I convinced myself I was human, something you'll never understand. Daniel's smile widened. Oh, I understand humanity perfectly. I understand that every person has a price, every loyalty can be bought, every principle can be bent. He gestured at the subdued ranch, at the men he had corrupted with money. Your precious Cash Dalton believed his men were loyal, but gold speaks louder than loyalty. Always has, always will. Not always, the voice came from the darkness beyond the torchlight. Thomas Yates emerged from the shadows, his deputy badge reflecting firelight. Behind him came Marshal Hayes and a dozen federal agents' rifles raised and ready. Hayes's voice carried absolute authority. Daniel Thornhill, you are under arrest for murder, attempted murder, fraud, racketeering, and about 15 other charges. I'll read you on the way to Helena. Drop your weapons, now. Before Daniel's men could react, an older man stepped forward from behind the federal agents. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and shoulders still broad from decades of ranch work. His eyes were the same gray-blue shade as Thomas Yates. Daniel Thornhill, the old man's voice carried across the snow-covered yard with surprising power. 20 years ago, you murdered my business partner James Yates, stole his ranch through forged documents, and when his widow fled with their infant son, you spent years trying to erase every trace of what you'd done. Thomas went rigid. What are you talking about? The old man turned to him, and Becca saw tears gleaming in eyes that mirrored Thomas's own. I am Marcus Whitman, owner of the Circle M Ranch. James Yates was my partner, my closest friend, and you, Thomas, are his son. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Daniel seemed frozen, his calculating mind trying to process this unexpected revelation. Marcus pulled a yellowed photograph from his coat. Your father and I built the Circle M together, equal partners, until Daniel forged documents claiming James had sold his share for a fraction of its value. When your father discovered the fraud, he confronted Daniel. 3 days later, James Yates died of sudden heart failure. The doctor said it was natural causes. I knew better. He extended the photograph to Thomas with shaking hands. Your mother Eleanor knew Daniel would kill her and you if she stayed. She fled to Boston, made me swear never to contact you, said it was the only way to keep you safe from Daniel's reach. But I've watched over you from a distance all these years. Thomas took the photograph, staring at a face that could have been his own aged 30 years. You're saying Daniel killed my father, that everything my mother told me about him dying of heart disease was a lie to protect me. Yes, and when Henrik Larson contacted me 6 months ago, told me you'd returned to Montana searching for Rebecca Quinn, I knew I had to act. Had to make sure Daniel couldn't destroy another generation of my family. Henrik stepped forward, his weathered face grave. Forgive me, Mr. Yates. I reported to Daniel at first, yes, but when I understood his true intentions, I went to Mr. Whitman instead. We have been working with Marshal Hayes since then. Hayes nodded confirmation. Mr. Whitman's testimony about the original land fraud gives us crimes stretching back 20 years. Combined with everything else, Daniel Thornhill will never see freedom again. Cash looked at Marcus with new understanding. That's why you helped me, why you provided resources and connections when I was investigating Daniel, not just for justice, but for family. For both, Marcus said quietly. He turned back to Thomas, his expression pleading. I know I have no right to ask forgiveness for staying away, but your father made me promise to protect you even from a distance. I've tried to honor that promise even when it meant watching you grow up without knowing who you truly were. Thomas stood motionless, the photograph trembling in his hands. Finally he looked up. Does this mean Hope has a grandfather? Marcus's face crumpled with emotion. If you and Rebecca will allow it, nothing would make me prouder than to be part of that little girl's life. Becca felt tears streaming down her face. She reached out and took Thomas's hand, squeezing it gently. Hope deserves to know her family. All of it. For a moment, no one moved. Daniel's hired guns looked at their employer, waiting for orders. Daniel himself seemed frozen, his calculated composure finally cracking. Then Henrik Larsson stepped forward from behind Hayes, his weathered face grim. "I am sorry, Miss Quinn. I was hired to watch you, to report your movements, but I could not stand by while this man planned murder. You were working for Daniel, at first. He paid well for information, but when I understood what he truly was, what he planned to do to you, I contacted Marshal Hayes, told him everything I knew." Daniel's face transformed into something ugly and desperate. "You won't take me. I have lawyers, connections, money enough to buy every judge between here and Washington. Your lawyers can't help you when a federal marshal has a warrant signed by a circuit judge." Hayes pulled papers from his coat. "Based on evidence provided by multiple witnesses, including testimony from Rebecca Quinn, Cash Dalton, Dr. Samuel Brennan, and your own former employee, Henrik Larsson." Daniel's hand moved with surprising speed, pulling a small pistol from his coat. He grabbed Becca, pressing the gun to her temple. "Everyone stays back, or I kill her right here." Cash surged against his bonds, but Daniel's men held him firm. "Thornhill, let her go. You're only making this worse. Worse, you've already destroyed everything I built, turned my own people against me. But I won't go to prison, Dalton. I won't give you, or Rebecca, or any of you, that satisfaction." The pistol's barrel pressed cold against Becca's skin. She felt the baby kick, as if protesting this latest indignity, and something inside her shifted. She had run from Daniel once, had hidden for months, had lived in fear of this exact moment. But fear was not the strongest emotion coursing through her now. Rage was. Pure, clean, clarifying rage at this man who had killed and poisoned and corrupted, who had stolen lives and futures with such casual cruelty. Becca drove her elbow backward into Daniel's ribs with all her strength. He gasped, his grip loosening just enough. She twisted free, falling to the snow-covered ground as the pistol discharged into empty air. Cash tore free from his captors and hit Daniel like an avalanche. They went down together, Cash's fists finding Daniel's face with methodical precision. Hayes and Thomas moved to separate them, but Cash had 8 years of grief and rage to work through first. Finally, Hayes pulled Cash off the bloodied lawyer. "Enough. He's not worth making you a murderer." Cash stood slowly, his knuckles split and bleeding, his chest heaving. He looked at Daniel's broken form on the ground, then at Becca still sitting in the snow. He moved to her, lifting her gently. "Are you hurt?" "The baby?" "We're fine. Shaken, but fine." Hayes's men were securing Daniel's hired guns, reading charges, and applying handcuffs with practiced efficiency. The ranch hands who had remained loyal were tending to the wounded. Ruby and Doc Brennan emerged from the house, relief evident on both their faces. Thomas approached Becca, his expression complicated. "I should have gotten here sooner, should have convinced Hayes to move faster. You saved us. That's what matters." "Did I, or did you save yourself?" Thomas looked at where Cash still held Becca's arm, steadying her. "I think I've known for a while now, known that you'd already made your choice, even if you hadn't said it aloud yet." "Thomas, I'm sorry." "Don't be. You deserve to be happy. And if Cash Dalton makes you happy, then I'm glad you found each other." He smiled, though pain shadowed his eyes. "I'll always love you, Becca, always treasure what we had, but I won't stand in the way of what you have now." He tipped his hat to Cash. "Take care of her. Both of them. You have my word." Thomas walked away, helping Hayes coordinate the arrests. Becca watched him go, feeling grief for the life they might have had, mixed with relief that she could finally move forward. Cash's arm came around her shoulders, warm and solid. "Let's get you inside. The excitement is over, and you need rest." But the excitement was not quite over. As they moved toward the house, Becca felt a sudden sharp pain low in her belly. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "Becca!" Another pain, stronger this time. Liquid warmth ran down her legs, soaking through her dress. Becca looked down at the spreading wetness and understood with perfect clarity what was happening. "My water just broke. The baby is coming." The bedroom that had been Becca's refuge for the past months transformed into a makeshift delivery room. Ruby and Doc Brennan worked with calm efficiency, heating water and gathering supplies while Cash hovered near the door, his face pale beneath the blood and bruises from the fight. "You should wait downstairs," Doc said, pulling on a clean shirt. "This isn't going to be quick or easy. I'm staying." Cash childbirth is not something most men are equipped to witness. "I don't care. I'm not leaving her." Becca, already gripped by another contraction, reached out her hand. "Let him stay, please." Doc exchanged glances with Ruby, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But Dalton, if you faint, I'm dragging you out of here myself." The night that followed tested every limit of Becca's endurance. The contractions came in waves, each one stronger than the last building, to peaks that stole her breath and blurred her vision. Between the pain, she was dimly aware of voices. Doc giving calm instructions. Ruby's gentle encouragement. Cash's hand gripping hers with steady pressure. "You're doing wonderfully," Doc said, checking her progress with clinical detachment. "But this is your first child and the baby is coming early. It's going to take time." Time became meaningless. Hours passed in a haze of pain and effort. Somewhere outside, dawn broke over the Montana landscape. Inside the bedroom, Becca existed in a world reduced to the basic mechanics of birth. Push, breathe, rest, repeat. "I can't do this," she gasped between contractions. "It's too much." Cash's face appeared in her vision, his winter sky eyes holding hers with absolute conviction. "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You built a cabin alone, survived Daniel's poison and fire, faced down killers without flinching. This is just one more impossible thing you're going to accomplish." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one being split in half." "True, but I'm right here with you, every moment, every breath." "You're not alone this time." Ruby wiped Becca's forehead with a cool cloth. "The baby is almost here. Just a little more, Becca. You're so close." Another contraction built stronger than all the ones before. Becca bore down with every ounce of strength remaining in her exhausted body. She felt something shift, felt the baby moving through the birth canal. "That's it," Doc encouraged. "One more push. Give me one more." Becca gathered herself for a final effort. Cash's hand tightened on hers, lending her his strength. Ruby's voice counted down, giving her something to focus on beyond the overwhelming pressure and pain. And then suddenly, the pressure released. The pain transformed into something different. Relief. Completion. A baby's cry filled the room, thin and indignant, announcing its arrival into the world with appropriate drama. "It's a girl," Doc announced, lifting the tiny, squirming infant. "Small but healthy, perfect in every way." He placed the baby on Becca's chest, and the world narrowed to the warm weight of new life against her skin. The baby was red and wrinkled, covered in vernix, her tiny fists waving in protest at being expelled from her warm cocoon. But to Becca, she was the most beautiful thing in creation. Tears streamed down Becca's face as she touched the downy hair on her daughter's head. "Hello, little one. I'm your mama, and I have been waiting so long to meet you." The baby quieted at the sound of her voice, as if recognizing something familiar in the tone she had heard from within the womb. Her tiny hand wrapped around Becca's finger with surprising strength. Cash stood beside the bed, his expression transformed by wonder. He reached out tentatively as if afraid to break the spell. When his finger touched the baby's cheek, she turned toward it, instinctively seeking food. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She is," Becca agreed. She looked up at Cash, at the tears shining in his eyes, and felt something settle into place in her chest. A certainty that had been building for weeks finally crystallized into absolute clarity. "Cash, I need to tell you something about choices and futures and what I want." "Becca, you just gave birth. You should rest. We can talk about complicated things later." "No, I need to say this now while everything is clear." She shifted the baby slightly, making room for Cash to sit on the edge of the bed. "I loved Thomas once, truly. But the woman who loved him died in that fire in Boston. I'm someone different now, someone Montana made, someone you helped me become." She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I choose you, Cash Dalton. I choose this life, this ranch, this complicated, beautiful mess we've made together, if you'll have me, if you'll have us." Cash's expression cycled through disbelief, hope, and finally pure joy. "If I'll have you, Becca, I've been waiting for you to choose me since the night I found you in that forest. You and this perfect little girl are all I want, all I'll ever want." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then the baby's, with exquisite gentleness. "But we're doing this properly. When you've recovered, when Daniel is safely behind bars, when you've had time to be absolutely certain this is what you want." "I'm certain now." "Then you'll be certain in a few weeks too, and I'll be right here waiting." Doc Brennan finished his examination of the baby and handed her back to Becca with a satisfied nod. "Mother and child are both healthy, small miracle considering everything you've been through tonight. But you need rest now, weeks of it. No excitement, no stress." Ruby laughed from her position near the door. "Doc, excitement and stress seem to follow Becca wherever she goes. I think rest might be more difficult than childbirth." "Then we'll make sure she gets it anyway." Cash stood smoothing the blankets around Becca and the baby with surprising domestic competence. "Ruby, can you send word to Hayes that we'll give formal statements tomorrow? And have someone ride to the Larson farm to let them know everyone is safe?" "Already done. Henrik left an hour ago to spread the word. By noon, everyone in the territory will know that Daniel Thornhill has been arrested and the Quinn baby arrived healthy." "Good." Cash turned back to Becca. "What will you name her?" Becca looked down at her daughter, who had fallen asleep against her chest, with the absolute trust of the newborn. She thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The fear and flight, the determination to survive, the unexpected love that had grown in the most unlikely soil. Hope. Her name is Hope. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of feeding schedules and sleepless nights, and the overwhelming responsibility of caring for a tiny human who depended entirely on Becca for survival. Cash proved surprisingly adept at helping appearing at odd hours with clean diapers or warm milk, taking Hope for walks around the house so Becca could sleep. Ruby transformed from wary sister to doting aunt, spending hours rocking the baby while Doc Brennan watched with poorly concealed longing. Something was developing between those two, Becca noticed, something that mirrored her own relationship with Cash. Hesitant, careful, full of unspoken possibilities. Marshal Hayes returned from Helena with news that Daniel's trial was set for spring. The evidence was overwhelming, the charges numerous. Daniel Thornhill would spend the rest of his life in prison if he lived long enough to stand trial. The beatings Cash had delivered, combined with the stress of arrest, had left him in poor health. Becca felt no sympathy, only relief that her daughter would grow up in a world where Daniel could never touch her. Thomas visited once 3 weeks after Hope's birth. He held the baby with gentle competence, his expression wistful. "She has your eyes, and Thomas Yates's stubborn chin, I think." "Will you stay in Montana?" Becca asked. "Or go back to Boston?" "Stay, I think. Hayes offered me a position as a federal investigator, tracking down men like Daniel, building cases against them." He looked up from Hope's sleeping face. "Turns out I'm good at it, and it feels right using what happened to us to help other people." He handed Hope back to Becca with obvious reluctance. "Be happy, Becca. You've earned it. You deserve happiness too. I'll find it someday, when I've made peace with losing you." He touched Hope's cheek one last time, then left without looking back. 6 months later, on a crisp March morning when the snow had finally begun to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the earth, Becca married Cash Dalton in the parlor of the ranch house. The ceremony was small. Ruby and Doc Brennan stood as witnesses, their own engagement newly announced. Henrik and Astrid Larson attended the old couple, holding hands like newlyweds themselves. A handful of ranch hands gathered respectfully in the back men who had remained loyal through the siege and earned Cash's permanent gratitude. Marshall Hayes gave Becca away, having developed a protective affection for the woman whose courage had helped him build the case of his career. The circuit judge performed the ceremony, his official capacity lending legal weight to vows spoken with absolute sincerity. When Cash slid the simple gold band onto Becca's finger, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had fled Boston had been broken and afraid. The woman standing in this parlor was whole and strong, built from the raw materials of survival and determination. "I love you," Cash said, his voice steady and sure. "I will love you and Hope and whatever children we might have together for as long as I draw breath. I love you too. You saw me when I was invisible, made me strong when I felt weak, gave me a home when I only knew how to run." They kissed to the applause of their small gathering, and Becca tasted salt on her lips. Tears, but not sad ones. These were tears of gratitude and relief and overwhelming joy. The reception that followed was simple and warm. Ruby had baked a cake. Doc Brennan produced champagne from some mysterious source. The ranch hands played fiddle and harmonica, filling the house with music that spoke of celebration and new beginnings. Hope, now 6 months old and alert to everything around her, watched from Ruby's arms with wide blue eyes. When Cash took her from his sister and held her high, making her laugh with delight, Becca felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. This was what she had been searching for when she fled to Montana. Not a cabin or 40 acres of land, not independence or isolation, but this: family, love. A place in the world that was entirely her own because she had built it with her choices and her courage. As the sun set over the ranch and the party continued around them, Cash drew Becca out onto the veranda. The air was cool but no longer bitter with winter's bite. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of growth and renewal. "Happy?" Cash asked, his arm around her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible." "Good, because I have plans for us. Big plans." He gestured toward the horizon, where rolling grassland stretched toward distant mountains. "I want to expand the ranch, build a school for the children in the territory, maybe even run for territorial legislature, push for laws that protect people from men like Daniel." Ambitious. You make me want to be ambitious. Want to build something that lasts beyond my lifetime, something Hope and her children can be proud of. Becca leaned into his warmth, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. "Then we'll build it together. The cabin I started alone, the ranch will grow as partners. Everything from here forward we do together." "Together," Cash agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Inside the house, music played and friends celebrated, and Hope laughed at something Ruby was doing. Outside, the Montana landscape spread vast and beautiful, full of possibilities waiting to be seized by those brave enough to reach for them. Becca had come to this territory broken and alone, carrying nothing but grief and determination. She was leaving that old life behind completely now, stepping into a future she had built with her own hands and her own choices. The homestead heart, she thought, remembering the name she had given this story in her own mind. A heart that had been homeless and wandering, that had finally found its place to take root and grow. She was home, truly home, and nothing and no one could ever take that away from her again. Epilogue. 2 years later, Becca stood in the garden behind the ranch house, Hope toddling beside her with the determined wobble of a child just mastering the art of walking. The garden had been Becca's project, transforming barren ground into rows of vegetables and flowers that bloomed in defiant abundance. "Mama, look," Hope pointed at a butterfly dancing among the roses. "I see it, sweetheart. Beautiful, isn't it?" Cash emerged from the barn, their son Matthew strapped to his chest in a carrier Ruby had sewn. At 4 months old, Matthew was a content baby, happy to ride along while his father worked. "The new foals are doing well," Cash reported, settling onto the garden bench beside Becca. "Henrik thinks we'll have the best breeding stock in the territory within 2 years. Henrik thinks everything you do is brilliant. Henrik is a wise man." Becca laughed and leaned her head on Cash's shoulder, watching hope chase the butterfly with single-minded determination. This was peace. This was joy. The simple, profound happiness of a life built on love and honest work. A rider approached from the east, and Becca recognized Ruby's posture in the saddle. Her sister-in-law was now Ruby Brennan, married to Doc Samuel and expecting their first child in the fall. She had given up accounting to study medicine under her husband's tutelage, much to the surprise of everyone who assumed wealthy women did not become doctors. Ruby dismounted and pulled an envelope from her saddlebag. "This came for you from Helena, from Marshall Hayes." Becca opened the letter with steady hands. She no longer feared news from the outside world. Daniel Thornhill had died in prison 6 months ago, his trial incomplete, but his guilt established beyond question. The threat he represented was gone forever. The letter was brief. Hayes was writing to inform her that the final legal proceedings were complete. Daniel's estate had been liquidated, his ill-gotten properties returned to their rightful owners, and there was a check enclosed, Becca's share of recovered assets from her brief employment at Daniel's firm. The amount was substantial, enough to expand the ranch significantly, to build that school Cash dreamed of, to secure Hope and Matthew's futures beyond any possible want. Becca folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. "What should we do with it? Whatever you want. It's your money. Our money. Everything is ours. Now, remember." Cash smiled and kissed her temple. "Then I suggest we use it to make Montana a better place. Build that school. Maybe a clinic so Doc doesn't have to travel 20 miles to see patients. Invest in the future we want our children to inherit." "Perfect." Becca stood and scooped Hope into her arms, the little girl protesting only briefly before settling against her mother's shoulder. "Come on, let's go inside and plan how to spend a fortune on other people's children." "That's my wife. Never met a problem she couldn't solve with determination and other people's money." They walked toward the house together, their children between them, their future bright with promise. Behind them, the garden bloomed in wild profusion. Ahead, the ranch spread across the land like a testament to what could be built when courage met opportunity. And above it all, the Montana sky stretched infinite and blue, holding space for dreams and plans, and all the beautiful complications of a life fully lived. Rebecca Quinn Dalton had come to Montana seeking invisibility. She had found instead a voice, a family, and a love that anchored her more surely than any cabin she might have built alone. This was home. This was happiness. This was the life she had fought for and earned, and would defend with every breath remaining in her body. The homestead heart had found its place at last, and it would beat steady and strong for all the years to come. The end.